Why is death so scary? The fear of death has been a discussion point of philosophers for a couple thousand years now, but still, almost everybody fears death in one way or another. So have the philosophers who've tried to tackle this just been wasting their time? Absolutely not. Thankfully, a lot of the ideas that have been worked through provide a roadmap on reducing a lot of the anxieties we have surrounding death. A lot of the ideas argued for also help enrich our quality of life while we're alive. A perfect example of how these ideas can be implemented is the movie Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. Using the film as a backdrop to illustrate the discussion points, let's look at the history of the philosophical arguments aimed at reducing our fear of death, and let's see how we can implement these ideas in our day-to-day lives. A good place to start is with Epicurus, who had a complex moral philosophy that prioritized tranquility. One of the biggest threats he saw to our ability to achieve tranquility was fear. One of the most dominant and unnecessary fears to Epicurus was death. Epicurus figured that he could help people get rid of some of their unnecessary fears through philosophical reasoning. So this is his argument, often called the no subject of harm argument, that really tries to reduce how fearful we are of death. And just as a note, I'm using Tim O'Keefe's formulation of the argument from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So first, death is annihilation. Death is the destruction of what you were. If you're dead, you're just not there anymore. When you're dead, you've been annihilated. Second, the living have not yet been annihilated. And that's just true because otherwise they wouldn't be alive. Third, death does not affect the living. This is from points 1 and 2. What he's talking about here is the state of being dead, which makes sense. If you're not there to feel what it's like to be dead or experience it at all, then it really doesn't affect you in the slightest. And fourth, so death is not bad for the living. And this is just from point 3. Fifth, for something to be bad for somebody, that person has to exist at least. Sixth, the dead do not exist. This is just an extension from his first premise that death is annihilation. And seventh, therefore death is not bad for the dead. This is from points 5 and 6. So finally, point 8, therefore death is bad for neither the living nor the dead. And this is from points 4 and 7. This argument is about death itself, meaning the actual state of being dead. It's not so much about the moments preceding death, which can obviously be quite painful and are obviously experienced. And death is also harmful to those we leave behind, like our friends and family. This argument was only meant to convince you that the state of being dead was not something to fear because it couldn't be something that was actually experienced. If you're not convinced yet, Lucretius, a follower of Epicurus, proposed the symmetry argument, which reiterates the idea that when you're dead, there is nothing there that experiences anything while in a state of death, let alone something bad. So there's nothing to fear. The symmetry argument goes like this. If you fear death, or can't imagine what this nothingness of death is like, imagine what it was like before you were born. There's every reason to believe that the infinity of nothing before you were born will be identical to the infinity of nothing after you die. So unless you think that period of time before you were born was a horrible state of affairs, then what's there to be afraid of? So if we follow both Epicurean arguments here, then beyond the sadness of our family and friends and the suffering experienced in the moments preceding our death, there is nothing bad about the actual state of death itself. And that's because there is nothing there after we're dead that can experience any negative state. And because there's nothing bad about death, there is nothing there to fear. So if Epicurus's and Lucretius's arguments work here, we should no longer fear death. But I'll be honest, it doesn't work for me. On a visceral level, this argument falls flat. Don't get me wrong, I think the no subject of harm argument and the symmetry argument do a good job reassuring us that the state of death itself isn't so bad. Most people would be able to accept this as long as it doesn't conflict with any of their religious beliefs. But the main problem people have with this argument is that it ignores the sense that our death causes us to miss out on a potentially positive future. When we die, there's a sense in which we're robbed of a future. So to say that death is of no harm to us kind of ignores the fact that we're being robbed of more life. Think of all the things you're looking forward to doing in the next month or so. Now, if you've got no friends and family and out of nowhere your head randomly exploded, if you experienced no pain before death, then according to Epicurus, after death there's no subject of harm. So overall, then it kind of seems like nothing bad has actually happened. But if you're this person, then for you, there's the sense that randomly exploding just robs you of all those things you were looking forward to doing, not just in the coming month, but all the things 20, 30, 40 years in the future. To give a framework to argue that this robbing is bad, we actually have to move away from hedonism, which is how we've been discussing all of this so far. The idea that moral goods and moral bads only come from pleasures and pains is a basic form of hedonism. If we accept the no subject of harm argument and the symmetry argument, then there's no pleasure or pain in the state of death, so there's no good or bad caused by death and therefore nothing to fear. But this simple form of hedonism doesn't capture the sense that death robs us of the goods that would come in a future were we not to die. Underlying this is the idea that part of the good that we get out of life lies in the gratification of our interests and goals. This idea that happiness comes from the fulfillment of goals and desires is called Preferentialism. So the occurrence of death immediately robs us of our ability to fulfill these goals, or as they're called, preferences. Maybe death's badness isn't so much in the harm it does us like a hedonist might understand, but maybe death's badness comes from the fact that it deprives us from the goods that come from a future where it doesn't occur. Compare a world where a baby is dropped on its head in the delivery room. That's a tragedy because when that baby dies, it's deprived of the goods that it would have otherwise experienced had that accident not occurred. Death's badness, coming from deprivation, also makes sense when we look at old people who have had a chance to live a long and fulfilling life. If that baby hadn't been dropped and lived to 100 years old, then their inevitable death at a century old doesn't deprive them of a long and potentially fulfilling life because they've already had one. Even though a 100-year-old's death would deprive them of some things, you'd normally say that it deprives them of less. All other things equal, you can say that the baby's death is worse than the 100-year-old's death by just looking at the degree of deprivation that death causes in both scenarios. And that makes sense intuitively. But here's the problem. Now we're back to square one. Death causes deprivation immediately, but it also stops us from experiencing the deprivation that it causes. This is in a similar vein to the no subject of harm argument, but a separate point entirely. Think of the badness that results from being deprived of anything. That badness is in the period you don't have the thing. Imagine in a dream that someone gives you an ice cream cone and slaps it out of your hand. The badness and deprivation start once your ice cream leaves your hand and it hits the floor. You might even wake up and say that the dream was a bad dream. But the thing about death is that it deprives you of the goods of life, but once you're in the state of death, you actually can't experience the deprivation and its badness. To continue the analogy, if someone handed you an ice cream in your dream and then you woke up before they slapped it out of your hand, then the only thing you experienced was a positive thing, them giving you the ice cream. Because you woke up early, you didn't get a chance to experience the badness of deprivation, which comes from them slapping it out of your hand. This is kind of how death works. It stops us from actually experiencing the badness associated with the deprivation it causes. Just to do a quick recap of where the arguments have led us from the start, we started with the fear of death. Epicurus highlights that there's no subject of harm in death, it's just nothingness. We've looked at hedonism as well as preferentialism to explain death's badness, but because there's no one that is subject to the deprivation that death causes, there's still no subject of harm in a way. If we don't experience the badness of death, we shouldn't fear it. It also doesn't really track with our intuition or gut feeling that death is bad for us, even if we don't experience the post-death state where we've been robbed of life and all its good stuff. I think saying there's no subject of harm here does nothing to reduce our fear of death, at least for the deprivation part, because it just doesn't track with our gut. To explain this mismatch between the ideas discussed and how we feel, let's switch up how we've been talking about the badness of death so far. Maybe death isn't just bad for us when we're dead. Let's figure out when the timing of death's badness can be attributed to. If we re-examine the timing of when we attribute death's badness, maybe then we can have a base for our currently unwarranted fear of death. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy lists 5 accounts for death's badness: concurrentism, priorism, subsequentism, indefinitism, and atemporalism. Let's work through them very quickly, because by the end of this, we'll have a good idea of when and why the badness of death occurs. From this, we can reduce our fear of death and also improve how we live our lives. Okay, if we're accounting for the badness that death causes through deprivation, then when does that badness occur? Let's answer this in the context of Puss in Boots' first 5 deaths. Concurrentism is the idea that death's badness occurs concurrently with the state of death, meaning at the same time. So the badness of our deaths occurs at the point in time that we start to experience death and the suffering it causes. This idea of death's badness running simultaneous to it is restricted to explaining the suffering we experience in purely hedonistic senses of pleasure and pain. Concurrentism is unable to account for the badness death causes due to deprivation, and this is what we've already discussed and red flagged. Death robs you of the ability to experience the deprivation it causes. So if we accept concurrentism, then it doesn't really seem like we can say that we are ever subject to death's badness through deprivation, just like the ice cream dream example. If you get run over by a bull and you die, and it's fairly quick, like you're dead in kind of 30 seconds, then concurrentism can explain your pain and say, sure, death is bad and the pain you experienced is bad, but it's unable to explain the badness of you being deprived of accomplishing all your desires. Priorism is the idea that the badness of death occurs prior to or before our death. Let's just reject hedonism, which talks about quality of life in terms of pleasure and suffering, and adopt preferentialism, which talks about quality of life in broader terms of achieving preferences, which includes not just achieving pleasure and avoiding pain, but also broader things like goals and personal values. This way we're not worried about discussing well-being as just pleasure and pain. A preferentialist could say that death's harms occur along the timeline of the occurrence of an ensuring event. So anything that ensures our death incurs the harm of death, as it stops us in that moment of being able to achieve whatever preferences or goals we have. So contracting a terminal disease that gives you 3 months to live can be an ensuring event. So if this were the case, the inability to pursue whatever long-term goals you hold because you're going to die would be the deprivation harm. This move allows us to place the harm of death somewhere on the timeline where we are alive, and death's harm can be attributed to us. This fights against the idea that we are never subject to death's harms. Whatever ensuring event occurs, it creates in that moment a deprivation harm because you're now unable to achieve your goals. I think priorism works with our intuitions when we think of something like contracting a terminal disease, because we have something that we can point to in the past and say, that's it. That's the exact point of badness on the universe's timeline. But the first objection to this is that the ensuring event's point in time is a very vague or debatable thing, because for all of us, death is unavoidable. So at the end of the day, isn't being the 1 out of 100 million sperm and being born the ensuring event for our own death? If you're born, you're gonna die. To take this objection to the extreme, we can take the causal chain of death's ensuring event, not just back to being born, but even events prior to our own birth, like when our parents met, or even earlier, like the Big Bang. The funny thing is, the second we attribute death's badness to a point in time prior to our birth, then remembering the symmetry argument, before we were born, we are also no subject of harm. So if a baby dies during birth, that is an extremely horrific tragedy. But under this theory of priorism, you might say that there weren't any moments prior to that baby's death to actually say the baby was at any point a subject of harm. Secondly, there's the issue that a baby hasn't developed mentally enough to even have any preferences under this theory. This theory can really struggle to explain that something so obviously tragic is even bad at all. The second objection to priorism is that we are not always worse off at the time of ensuring events. You could say at the moment someone notices you cheating at a game of poker, there is no badness there because nothing has happened yet. So to say this is the ensuring event of your death and the exact moment where death's badness can be located might not be agreeable. I mean, what's the difference between getting caught cheating at poker by someone who will let it go, if you just give them their money back, and getting caught cheating by someone who then kills you? Maybe the difference would be that if you get caught cheating and then killed, that's where death's badness is, right at the moment you're killed. But then we're just back at the theory of concurrentism, which we're not happy with as an account for the badness of death. It seems Priorism isn't really an intuitive approach to understanding how death is bad, and it requires a bit of mental gymnastics to locate death's badness and accept the theory. So let's move on to Subsequentism. Subsequentism is the idea that the badness of death occurs after death. The problem here is that we're starting out the Epicurean argument, no subject of harm, with the premise that death itself is annihilation. We don't exist physically at all after death. So the case for Subsequentism is a difficult one to make. Some arguments for Subsequentism go down extremely convoluted rabbit holes, so I won't go into too much detail. But to me, the most understandable or acceptable approach that's made by Subsequentists is the attribution of welfare properties to people and their corpses. So for example, if I am currently joyous, then when I die, I lack joy. So if we put the tag of joy on me right now, and then we flash to my corpse, and then we put the tag of lacks joy on my corpse, then there's the deprivation harm. Because we start the Epicurean argument with the idea that death is annihilation, then a corpse specifically can't have any welfare properties like joy. But we can say that death causes annihilation, so a corpse must lack welfare properties. I feel that the attribution of welfare properties on our corpses to account for death's badness fails to bypass the no subject of harm argument. It fails because if this badness is being attributed after the fact of us being annihilated, then we're not around to experience this harm. But I should note that some people do stand firm here. I'll just screenshot the Stanford Encyclopedia entry's last paragraph on Subsequentism and put that up on the screen now. Feel free to pause the video and read it if you like. Anyway, let's move on to Indefinitism, which is the idea that the badness of death cannot be pinpointed on a timeline, which kind of seems like where we've been leading to. So to quote Nagel, although the spatial and temporal locations of the individual who suffered the loss are clear enough, the misfortune itself cannot be so easily located. One must be content just to state that his life is over and there will never be any more of it. That fact, rather than his past or present condition, constitutes his misfortune, if it is one. An analogy offered for something similar is the onset of male pattern baldness. Let's say someone is balding. There's no exact timing for this, it's just a fact. And if we have to locate the time that balding occurs chronologically, it's not a pinpoint moment in time, it's more of an overarching bracket of time. Nagel argues this is the same as death. Death's badness occurs in a time referred to as a stretch of time with blurry boundaries. While I like this analogy, a priorist could point to an ensuring event like genetic or environmental factors for baldness, so this isn't necessarily a bulletproof stance, but it's definitely a pragmatic one. In his article, How Does Death Harm the Deceased?, Taylor Sear says, "We may not be able to pinpoint the exact temporal location of death's harm to the deceased. Even if the timing of the harm of death is indeterminate, it does not follow that there is no time at which death harms the deceased." This might seem like a bit of a cop-out, but it does give a good framework for roughly locating when the badness of my death and the deprivation caused by our death occurs. And lastly, there's atemporalism. Atemporalism is the idea that the badness of death need not be pinpointed on a timeline for its badness to still be the case. This response fully rejects the Epicurean presumption that the badness of death needs to be located at a point in time for its badness to be acknowledged. So we don't even have to look for the exact time that we experience the badness of death due to the deprivation death brings about. In the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on atemporalism, it says, If true at all, the proposition that death is overall bad for us is an eternal, a timeless truth. So it doesn't matter if you explode quickly or get done in by a pack of animals, death's badness just is. Atemporalism reduces the idea that death causes badness to a brute fact. That's the 5 main responses made when trying to figure out where and when the badness of deprivation, which is caused by death, should be attributed to on a timeline. So to recap the philosophical discussion so far, we can kind of just say that death is bad for us in the sense that it deprives us of the goods of life. The degree of badness this is, and when we actually experience this badness, is up for debate. But at least now, we know the specific ways in which death is bad for us, and also the ways in which it is not. Now let's go on to some takeaways from this. One immediate takeaway lies in knowing the ways in which death isn't bad for us.
I just love the smell of fear.
We've already run through a pretty exhaustive examination of how death is bad, so it should strip away a lot of the fears we have surrounding the state of death. For a large amount of the population, death evokes fear because it is some nebulous, scary thing. But death is just the end. And we don't even experience any of it once we're dead. So fear is a reasonable response to things that are bad to experience, but death isn't experienced. And this is what Epicurus covers. But going even further and looking at how death deprives us, if we adopt a theory to account for death's badness in this way, like atemporalism, then if we explain death's deprivation or badness as a brute fact, then under this account, that badness is still never actually experienced. And if you think of the things you personally fear, those are all things you're able to experience eventually, unlike death. So while we might be able to say that death is bad at the end of all these philosophical arguments, it's pretty clear that the emotion of fear is not a fitting response. Puss in Boots is a character that has no issue going through the physical pains associated with death. He's already done it 8 times in the film, and he actually wants to top up his lives, assuming he's going to continue living carelessly and dying unnecessarily. And that's because he doesn't fear dying. In fact, he's happy to do it again and again. But he really fears the state of death. And we see his growth come the moment he stops fearing death. His character development can only really be said to occur at the end of the film, where he changes from fearing death to respecting it. Some more appropriate emotional responses to death's arrival might be a feeling of powerlessness, anger, or even reverence. Without jumping too far ahead, there are even ways death can be motivational. But at the end of the day, when looking at the emotions, it doesn't seem like fear is the most fitting response. Internalizing this immediately improves your quality of life because you'll reduce the experience that you have now of a negative emotion that can pop up in your day-to-day life based on how scary you find death and its harms. Here's another takeaway. Now we know the ways in which death is bad and harms us, we can reduce the ways in which death harms us right now. Death harms us through depriving us from being able to accomplish the things we want to do. Beyond maximizing pleasures and minimizing pains, death stops us from being able to fulfill the goals and projects we work towards. This is what we spoke about when we spoke of preferentialism. A knee-jerk reaction to this would be to eliminate all desires that our death will deprive us of. There are some meaningful goals we can set ourselves that our own death won't necessarily stop, like placing a lot of value in the well-being of family and friends. But there's not a whole lot. The problem here is that if we eliminate all desires that death will harm, then we are harmed before we die because we live with such a limited set of desires. Stephen Looper says, if we resolve from now on to limit ourselves to desires whose objects cannot be falsified by death, we are still vulnerable to the harm death will do us if it precludes our having and fulfilling desires. He says this would force us to avoid having any desires whose fulfillment would have benefited us, and to deny ourselves such desires would be as bad for us as the harm we are trying to avoid. So while getting rid of desires altogether might be counterproductive, Epicurus himself preached that we should live our lives with a reduced and minimalist set of goals and desires. A reduced set of desires is a core tenet of his school, Epicureanism, which I've done a detailed video on previously. I think part of the solution lies in this approach, and it's seen in other traditions like Buddhism. Also, instead of taking this desire minimalism to the extreme, we can do a stock take of our personal goals and make sure their accomplishment is realistic for a normal lifetime. And as you approach death, this takeaway becomes more and more applicable. If you're aging or diagnosed with a terminal illness, deciding to go from illiteracy to becoming a best-selling author is just dumb. Overall, altering your desires to being realistic and having a smaller core set of impactful, bang-for-your-buck life goals is a useful move in light of understanding death's harms through deprivation. With the idea of death and its harms being discussed by Epicurus in ancient Greece, there are other cultures and spiritual traditions around the world that touch on really similar ideas. The expression Memento Mori gained popularity with the growth of Christianity and is currently popular in modern Stoic discussions. Memento Mori is Latin for remember that you have to die, and is a reminder of the inevitability of death. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a similar concept of Maranasti, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of, but it's the Buddhist meditation practice of routinely reminding yourself that death can come unannounced and that we should also live our life with urgency at all times. Similar sentiments are found around the world in Japanese Zen and samurai culture, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and Hindu teachings. Around the world, it seems like general death mindfulness is a common teaching, and its benefits are twofold. If practiced frequently, death mindfulness can reduce our fear of death and get our emotional response to be one that's much more accepting. Secondly, what seems to be widespread is the idea that intentionally reminding ourselves of our own death frequently forces us to acknowledge the finite time we have left on Earth and to direct our efforts towards our goals more urgently.
I know I can never defeat you, Lobo, but I will never stop fighting for this life.
A frequent practice of Memento Mori, or something similar, works well with the idea that death's badness lies in its deprivation. If death is bad because it robs us of our desires, and death is inevitable, then we'd better hurry and work towards achieving our goals before death comes knocking. Starting this discussion, our goal was to reduce our fear of death, and I think we've done it for the most part. By understanding the angles philosophers have taken over the years to analyse death and the way it's bad, we can see the first takeaway, namely that fear isn't an appropriate response to death. The second takeaway is that we can alter our desires, within reason, to reduce the extent that death harms us. And lastly, a practice of Memento Mori has persisted throughout history and across cultures, and it's a way to understand the inevitability of death and to use the reality of our time being finite to motivate us to live more urgently and intentionally. But here's where I find the philosophical discussions of death hitting a dead end. For me, it doesn't matter how much you practice Memento Mori daily or amend your desires. Right now, I don't know how I am going to die. I might die painlessly in my sleep. I might also be eaten alive by a shark when I'm at the beach. I have no idea how much suffering I'll experience as I die, and no idea how much forewarning I'll get. Fear might not be a fitting response to death itself, but dying is scary, and I think dying warrants fear. The problem with the commonly used phrase, fear of death, is that no matter how much we eliminate the fear of death being the state, no one can get to the stage of death without going through the earlier moments of dying. And to me still, this is the scariest part of death, with fear being a very reasonable response to dying. So if at this point you ask yourself if you fear death, and the answer is still yes, maybe re-examine that feeling, and you might find that the part of death you find daunting is the dying part, not the state of death itself. I think the phrase fear of death in philosophical discussions is often loaded because any time we entertain the idea of death, dying unavoidably comes along for the ride. So in the spirit of the discussion, let's look at what can be done to reduce the harms of dying, those moments preceding death. If we're able to reduce the harms of dying, not only does that benefit us as we experience those moments of dying, but being equipped to go through those moments and minimize the harm experienced should help reduce our fear of those moments, which will inevitably arrive one day. Firstly, the badness of dying can mostly be accounted for by its mental and physical pains. So instinctively we might just say, if we know we're going to be dying, then just preemptively take a bunch of painkillers. But to properly attend to the mental experience throughout the process of dying, this might not be the best response. Let's separate death from dying, with death being the nothingness after we die, but dying being the often painful moments that are experienced leading up to death. Let's turn to an author who has a really interesting background. Frank Ostazeski is an end-of-life care specialist with a background in Buddhism who trains healthcare workers in hospice care. Through his work, he's assisted thousands in the process of dying. And in his book, The 5 Invitations, I think his anecdotal account of death and dying fills in a lot of the gaps left by the discussion we've had about death and dying so far. In fact, if summarized, his 5 invitations, which the book revolves around, can clue us in on how to reduce the badness of dying. And that's by reducing the mental and physical pains experienced before death, while also attending to our deeper goals and desires. Ostazeski summarizes the insights he's learned from dying as effectively the 5 invitations to be present. His 5 invitations are 1. Don't wait. 2. Welcome everything, push away nothing. 3. Bring your whole self to the experience. 4. Find a place to rest in the middle of things. And 5. Cultivate a don't know mind. Now, a lot of these invitations or takeaways apply to providing palliative care with dignity and are usable when we have forewarning that death is coming for us. These invitations or lessons are less applicable the less foresight or awareness we have that we're going to die. I think invitations 2, 3, and 4 are relevant to our discussion now, specifically because they help in reducing the harms of dying as we die. So, invitation 2, welcome everything, push away nothing, is just a takeaway in his book on dying well and reducing our suffering while dying. In an interview he said, when we fight against the truth of things coming and going, we suffer. I think here an attitude of acceptance in the face of death being something that reduces our suffering pairs well with the discussion we've had of Memento Mori. The next invitation, bring your whole self to the experience, is again about dying well and reducing our suffering while dying. It builds on the previous invitation's sentiment of acceptance and posits that being present is another component of dying well. The last thing you want to do in the face of death is bury your head in the sand, which is something he discusses witnessing. Sometimes when people are given a certain terminal diagnosis, if they can't work past a stage of denial, then they don't get around to being present and then addressing what matters in their final moments. Frank sees people dying well when they welcome the experience, including the scary internal thoughts and daunting discussions with family and friends. Pairing these 2 invitations of effectively acceptance and being present throughout the process of dying constitutes a large part of what it is to die well. And this is coming from someone who's observed and assisted thousands of people through the process of dying. And lastly, the takeaway, find a place to rest in the middle of things, is his takeaway that's a bit more practical, and it allows you to reduce your suffering while dying through meditation, presentness, and breathwork. I'd recommend reading the book for a further elaboration on each of these invitations if it interests you, because I'm really glossing over a lot of the nuance he brings to each invitation. Anyway, that's it for today. Hopefully you now fear death less. And in line with Memento Mori and Puss in Boots, hopefully you live life more urgently. At the end of the day, if the part of death you fear is dying, now at least you've got some practical tips on how to die in a way that minimizes suffering and also allows you to attend to your desires as best you can. A bit of a grim chat, but I hope you found it useful.